which is quite something, let me tell you. Okay, this is just repeating what Carl just told you about the contract that was awarded, and I really felt highly privileged to be selected, though in some ways I feel like a historical figure myself in this thing. So anyway, it's been meant a lot to me because I've been around this field so long to see it finally put together in a history which I think for students, for practitioners, is just really so critical. Well, as Carl told you, our part for the United States and Canada is divided into two. The video interviews, which Jody is going to tell you more about, as well as a review of the EAP literature. Now, just imagine my problem. How the heck am I going to put this history together? Where am I going to get it? How are we going to do it? So, what I started with was developing a conceptual framework of what I thought were the major issues and developments in the field. And when you see the final product, you will see all of that. We are still in, you might say this is a work in progress, almost at the end. So what I then did was, with this kind of, a framework in my mind, I then reviewed the following literature. All of these journals, which you see, these are the main EAP journals where most of the articles have been. But then I went to other sources because we knew, for example, that we had some articles like, for example, the one that came out in the Harvard Business Review. We knew that SHRM had some. Now, how, when I say, did I review it? And I do want to acknowledge Dr. Chernick from Canada, who really had a treasure trove of materials, which he has shared and sent to me. So that really helped as far as getting the materials from Canada, because they were not necessarily published materials. So that was really very helpful. So with these journals, what I did is went through all of the content, as not a reading them, but the topics. And when I saw something that looked like it hit into the conceptual framework, for example, if I saw something that was written on managed care, or if I saw something on drug-free workplace, that article would get pulled. Now, fortunately, because of the archive at Maryland with journals, but then also because of raiding Jody's library, my own library, going all over to get these, we got them from various sources. I reviewed and then ticked off all of these various articles, and then started the process of reading them and applying them to the conceptual framework as far as history. Now, in addition, I knew that individual people in the field, for example, and the list is here, Mark, Jody, Paul Roman, had written various articles, but were not necessarily in the major EAP journals. They might be someplace else. So we went back and looked at all of the bibliographies of we selected these people, as you can see here. And so we looked at whatever they had written. So then, what we did is, I broke it into historical periods, beginning 50-year periods. So we had this lined up that way. So not only do we have the articles, but then we had them in kind of a time frame. So as we then wrote this report, we also, for example, obviously, besides putting them into periods, we then, of course, had an endnotes. A full bibliography is presented. That's one of the biggest advantages you're going to have when this comes out, because there's quite a bibliography as far as further readings that will be recommended. Now, I want you to take a look at this, because this is, it's very hard in 15 minutes up here to try to show you the 50 years of what we've done. But if you look at this chart, what I found most interesting is occupational social work was around for years and years before EAPs even got started. And so if you look at this, I really want you to take a look at it, and you might have questions about it, because it really shows you, for example, as we start, how far back the whole question of occupational social work existed decades before the EAP field or occupational alcoholism started. We usually think of our field as beginning with occupational alcoholism, but this whole history before of working in the workplace. And for example, it was 1905, Macy's department store had a social worker. So, in other words, there's a whole history there that we as the field had not really, necessarily looked at or were aware. So they were staffed by social workers. Now, if you begin to compare with the field of occupational alcoholism, which of course was before EAPs, you could see, for example, that what you had with staffing, you went from recovering alcoholics to the EAP field, where it then went back to social workers, psychologists, etc. But the university affiliation is very interesting because Columbia and Hunter clearly led in the field of occupational social work. And there was quite a bit of hostility, because I can tell you I lived that hostility in occupational alcoholism. When I started at Boston College and went into occupational alcoholism, it was like, how can you do that? How can you really get into this field? And there was tremendous, you might say, two fields running parallel, neither one speaking to the other. And it was really quite interesting to see. But the other thing, it was financed by the government. NIMH had a very, very large grant for years that went to Columbia University for the workplace. It was also very union identified. And then you had NASW, you had NIAAA that came in with the occupational alcoholism. And then, of course, we moved into the whole concept of the EAP, the public law, that whole area. Now, the pioneers clearly, what you can see was Shelley Acabas, Paul Kurtzman, who now, Paul has kind of come over to the EAP field for a while. I mean, I could remember actually fighting with Shelley and Paul when they said to me, how can you work with executives? How can you as a social worker work with executives? And I would say, you don't think executives have problems? Let me tell you. But then they'd say, well, but they can afford help. So I mean, this whole psychological thing was going on, and I really don't know that the occupational alcoholism or EAP field was really aware of all of that in the field of social work. What's ironic to me now as a social worker is to see that, that we're being staffed, the predominant staff of EAPs, the affiliates are social workers, over 50% today. EAPA will tell you that, as you look at that. So it's kind of interesting. I'm glad to see my field of social workers recognized, what we've got in this field now. So, and then of course you have the different organizations. You had NASW social work, then you had ALMACA, and then we moved to EAPA and ESNA. So it's really quite fascinating from there. All right, now breaking it by, you might say, something sometimes chronologically for you, but of course in the actual report it's splintered out much more. So we have, for example, 85, we have the core technology. I thought you were telling me something. Okay. Then, for example, in 87, that was the first time that we switched from going to internal programs to external with the famous IBM program, and that's when both HAI and PPC were awarded. So the field switched from being internal to external. And it's interesting, and I'm sure Carl well remembers this, that it was so large, IBM was so large at the time, 250,000 employees plus family members. I was the consultant for them, And I said to them, you gotta use 2 providers, because neither one at this time were big enough to handle the entire IBM. So that was the beginning of switching to the external model.
If I could interrupt just a second, Dale.
Of course, okay.
Otto and I both disagreed with that we weren't big enough to handle all of IBM.
You can imagine. Now that's the other thing, on top of talking about fighting with the social workers, because I was